we're watching this in real time that there is no audio on this, but you do not need to listen to this because what we are seeing here is kick after kick.
Bro, lay down.
I'm just trying to go home. Mom!
But for me to find out that my son was calling my name,
I promise you that Tyree would have rather raised his son, and he deserved to grow old.
On January 7th, 2023, a tragic incident unfolded in Memphis, Tennessee, one that would stir a nation and reignite the long-standing conversation about police violence and systemic reform in the United States. The man you see here, beaten mercilessly by more than 5 police officers, was 29-year-old Tyree Nichols. What began as a routine traffic stop spiraled into a nightmare of brutality, and within days, Nichols was dead. Though the Memphis Police Department moved swiftly to fire and arrest all 5 officers involved, the damage was already done. The video footage, released to the public, captured every horrifying moment of Nichols' beating, images so raw and disturbing they sparked outrage across the country. Protests erupted in Memphis and beyond, with citizens demanding accountability and justice. This was not just another headline about police violence, it was a wake-up call, a visceral reminder of how unchecked power can destroy lives. How many more lives must be lost before real change takes place? But before the shocking footage is revealed, we need to go back in time to understand how it all began. 29-year-old Tyree Nichols was born on June 5, 1998 in Memphis, Tennessee. He was the beloved son of his mother, Rovera Nichols, and his stepfather. Tyree's family described him as a kind, peaceful, and hard-working man, someone who sought to live a fulfilling life despite the many challenges he faced. But little did he know, the biggest of life's challenges was just about changing the trajectory of his life. Tyree worked tirelessly to build a life for himself, not only for his own happiness, but also to set a positive example for his younger siblings. He was more than just a son, he was a father, a friend, and a dedicated family member. He often put the needs of others ahead of his own and was known for his generosity and humility. His family and friends could always count on him to be there when they needed support, whether for a listening ear or a helping hand. His calm demeanor and strong work ethic earned him respect in his community, and his legacy was one of love and compassion. Tyree seemed destined for greatness. That was until everything changed. Though Tyree Nichols had many aspirations, his life was tragically cut short due to the actions of 5 Memphis police officers. He was employed at FedEx, working to provide for his loved ones, but beyond his job, he was deeply involved in his community and remained close to his family. He cherished every moment with his son, knowing the importance of creating a stable environment for his future. Sadly, he would not live long to accomplish any of his dreams. On the night of January 7, 2023, at approximately 8:24 p.m., Tyree Nichols was driving down a Memphis street when he was pulled over by the police. The reason for the stop was reportedly an alleged traffic violation. Police claimed Nichols had been driving aggressively and dangerously, posing a threat to others on the road. However, the video footage of the incident would later reveal that there was no clear evidence to support these claims. As Nichols was stopped, 5 police officers, part of a specialized unit known as the Scorpion Unit, approached his vehicle. This unit was established to combat violent crime in high-crime areas of Memphis. The officers' roles were to respond quickly to threats and make arrests as needed. But, as events unfolded, their use of force quickly escalated beyond what was necessary or justified. The first attempt to detain Nichols occurred when the officers demanded he exit the car. Nichols, confused and understandably frightened, attempted to ask the officers why he was being stopped. As he questioned their actions, the police responded by becoming increasingly aggressive, using physical force to pull him from the vehicle. Fearing for his life, Nichols managed to break free and attempted to flee the scene. He ran, hoping to escape the escalating violence. However, he was soon overtaken by the officers, and what followed next would be nothing short of horrifying. At around 8:30 p.m., Nichols was caught by the police, and the beating began. surveillance and body camera footage captured the brutality of the officers' actions. The 5 police officers savagely beat Nichols with their fists, batons, and even used pepper spray in an effort to subdue him. Despite Nichols not posing a threat or resisting, the officers continued to strike him relentlessly. Throughout the assault, Nichols screamed for help, crying out to his mother and pleading for the violence to stop.
Bro, lay down.
I'm just trying to go home. Mom!
His cries were ignored, and his pain seemed to fuel the officers' aggression. The police showed no concern for his well-being, and even as Nichols lay on the ground, clearly incapacitated, they failed to offer any help or attempts to administer first aid. But that was only the beginning. After the brutal beating, Nichols was finally left on the ground as the officers discussed the incident amongst themselves. An ambulance was called, but it took 20 minutes for paramedics to arrive. Nichols was transported to the hospital, where his condition was assessed as critical. For 3 days, Tyre Nichols fought for his life in the hospital, but the damage caused by the beating was too severe. But the most chilling part would happen days later. On January 10, 2023, Tyre Nichols passed away from his injuries. His cause of death was determined to be a cerebral hemorrhage, a result of the excessive blows delivered during the beating. The 5 officers involved in Nichols' death were members of the Memphis Police Department's Scorpion Unit. This unit, created to address rising crime in Memphis, had been given special powers to use aggressive methods when responding to crime. However, as was tragically revealed that night, these methods resulted in police brutality that led to an innocent man's death. What was designed to fight crime instead unleashed a new kind of terror. The same aggressive tactics that were supposed to protect Memphis ended up exposing a darker truth, that unchecked power can turn predators into prey. When the brutality against Tyre came to light, it soon ignited a firestorm. The tragic and violent death of Tyre Nichols set off a wave of outrage across Memphis and beyond, as protests erupted in the streets, calling for accountability and an end to police brutality. The Memphis Police Department moved swiftly to address the situation. On January 20th, just days after Nichols' death, Memphis Police Chief Saralyn C.J. Davis condemned the actions of the officers involved in the beating. She promised that a full and independent investigation would be conducted with a focus on transparency and justice. She vowed to seek justice and hold those responsible accountable.
As you know, 5 Memphis police officers were terminated last week. These officers were found to be directly responsible for the physical abuse of Mr. Nichols. Concurrent within that investigation, other MPD officers are still under investigation for department policy violations. Some infractions are less egregious than others. As this investigation and other external investigations continue, I promise full and complete cooperation from the Memphis Police Department with the Department of Justice, the FBI, the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, and the Shelby County District Attorney's Office to determine the entire scope of facts that contributed to Tyre Nichols' death.
This statement was echoed by members of the public who felt that the trust between law enforcement and the community had been deeply violated. The Memphis Police Department did not waste time in addressing the issue. On January 25, 2023, just over 2 weeks after the incident, the 5 officers involved in the beating were fired from their positions. These officers were identified as Tadarius Bean, Demetrius Haley, Desmond Mills Jr., Emmett Martin Jr., and Justin Smith, all of whom were African American. This fact added yet another layer of complexity to the national conversation about police brutality and race. In response to the incident, the Memphis Police Department also made the decisive decision to disband the Scorpion Unit, which had been responsible for policing the area where Nichols was assaulted. The unit had been established in 2021 to address rising crime in Memphis, but its aggressive tactics and use of excessive force led to the tragic outcome in Nichols' case. Memphis Police Chief Saralyn emphasized that while the Scorpion Unit had been formed with good intentions, it had failed to meet the expectations of the community and ultimately contributed to this tragedy. Following the firings, the next step was the legal process. On January 26, 2023, just over 2 weeks after the incident, the 5 officers involved in Nichols' death were officially charged with second-degree murder, aggravated kidnapping, official misconduct, and unlawful use of force. Second-degree murder charges suggest that the officers intentionally caused Nichols' death without premeditated intent. Tennessee District Attorney Steve Mulroy made it clear that the actions of the officers had not only violated the law, but also betrayed the public trust. The criminal charges drew significant attention, with people across the country closely monitoring the developments. Many were outraged by the fact that the officers were initially released on bail, with amounts ranging from $250,000 to $350,000. This decision prompted further protests and calls for immediate and harsher accountability.
We had Demetrius Haley, Tadarius Bean, and we had Justin Smith all walk in the courtroom today with shackles on and in blue jumpsuits, very different than what we have been seeing over the past 3 weeks now.
We always put 3 and 2. 3 of them basically did more damage than the other 2. But they all had some kind of part in my son's death.
As the legal proceedings progressed, the defense attorneys for the accused officers began to mount their cases. One of the primary arguments put forward by the defense was that the police officers acted in the heat of the moment, under stress, and with the belief that Tyree was attempting to resist arrest. They argued that the officers had acted within their positions and had followed orders in a chaotic situation. However, they insisted that they never intended for Nichols' death to occur and that it was an overreaction to the situation, not premeditated murder. However, prosecutors contested this defense. They pointed to the overwhelming evidence that showed the officers continued to use force against Nichols even after he had stopped resisting. Body camera footage and surveillance footage of the scene clearly demonstrated that Tyree posed no threat and had been subdued, yet the officers continued to beat him, with no attempts to provide medical assistance until long after the assault ended. The lack of compassion and failure to aid the victim after the beating only deepened the gravity of the charges against them. While the legal proceedings continued, the public's outrage showed no sign of stopping. Protests erupted across the country, starting in Memphis and spreading to major cities like New York, Los Angeles, Washington, and Chicago. Demonstrators carried signs that read "Justice for Tyree" and "Stop Police Violence," while chanting slogans that were synonymous with the Black Lives Matter movement. The protests grew louder and more widespread as people demanded not just justice for Tyree, but systemic reforms in policing. Activists and human rights defenders called for an overhaul of police practices, particularly in how police officers engage with communities of color. Civil rights leaders like Reverend Al Sharpton spoke at rallies condemning the police's actions and calling for a complete transformation of the justice system. Tyree Nichols' family, especially his mother, Rovera Nichols, became vocal advocates for justice in the aftermath of his death. Rovera expressed her heartbreak and anger over the brutality that her son endured. She called for accountability, not just for the 5 officers involved, but for the broader system of law enforcement that had allowed such a tragedy to occur. As the legal process unfolded, Rovera and other family members of Tyree remained at the forefront of the fight for justice, pushing for the case to be a catalyst for change. The public support for the Nichols family was overwhelming, with many calling for not only justice in this case, but broader reforms in the criminal justice system. But justice would not come easily. As the investigation continued and the charges against the 5 officers moved forward, the trial became the focal point of the public's attention. For many, it wasn't just about seeking justice for Tyree Nichols, it was about a larger reckoning with police violence, systemic racism, and the failures of law enforcement to protect vulnerable communities. The trial of the 5 Memphis police officers accused in the brutal beating of Tyree Nichols began to take shape with mounting evidence, including video footage, witness testimony, and the officers' own conflicting statements. The prosecution also relied on witness testimonies, including one from another patrolling officer who had witnessed the entire brutal assault. This testimony helped establish the narrative of how the police officers had gone beyond their duty to enforce the law and instead used excessive force to punish Tyree, resulting in his eventual death. Additionally, the defense for the accused officers struggled to justify their actions. Their main argument was that the officers had acted in the heat of the moment, under stress, and in response to what they perceived as a threat. They suggested that Tyree's attempt to escape could have been seen as resistance, which led the officers to react with force. However, the defense's position did little to sway the public's perception of the case, especially as the footage clearly showed Tyree's vulnerability and lack of resistance as he begged for the beating to stop. The trial of the 5 police officers became a flashpoint in the ongoing debate about police violence and the need for reform. While the legal proceedings played out in court, the nation remained deeply divided over the issue of policing. Advocates for police reform, including civil rights groups and activists, continued to pressure lawmakers to take action. The protests sparked by Tyre Nichols' death did not subside during the trial. If anything, they intensified. As more video evidence came to light and more people witnessed the brutality Nichols endured, the anger in the streets grew. The public was demanding not just accountability for the officers involved, but systemic change in the way police interacted with communities of color. The Black Lives Matter movement, which had been at the forefront of the fight for justice in police violence cases, found itself mobilizing again, with larger rallies and protests taking place across the country. Activists pointed to the fact that Tyre Nichols was not the only victim of police brutality, and that communities of color continued to bear the brunt of law enforcement's misuse of power. The protests demanded the passage of the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act, which aimed to establish national standards for police behavior and ensure better accountability for police misconduct. On November 2, 2023, former Officer Desmond Mills Jr., one of the officers involved, entered a guilty plea to federal charges of excessive force and obstruction of justice. His cooperation with prosecutors marked the first major break in the case, as he agreed to testify against his fellow officers. By 2024, the U.S. Department of Justice filed civil rights charges against all 5 officers, including deprivation of rights under color of law resulting in death, conspiracy to make false statements, and obstruction of justice. This expanded the case beyond Tennessee, ensuring accountability under federal law. By late 2025, verdicts were handed down. Demetrius Haley was found guilty on all counts, including murder and civil rights violations. Emmett Martin and Desmond Mills pleaded guilty and cooperated with prosecutors. Tadarius Bean and Justin Smith were convicted of obstruction of justice, but acquitted of murder. As of February 2026, formal sentencing is scheduled to follow the verdicts. Several officers faced decades in prison or life sentences, depending on the final rulings. Their conviction marked a historic moment in the fight for justice in the United States, but for many, it was only the beginning of the larger struggle for police reform. Despite the conviction, the fight for justice did not end with the verdict. The case of Tyre Nichols had once again exposed the deep flaws in the U.S. policing system, and the public demand for reform only intensified. Activists, lawmakers, and concerned citizens continued to call for the dismantling of systems that perpetuate police violence and racial discrimination. Tyre Nichols' family filed a civil suit against the city of Memphis and the police department, seeking damages and systemic reform. The case remains ongoing, focusing on broader accountability beyond the individual officers. At the state and federal levels, lawmakers pushed for new legislation aimed at improving police accountability and reducing instances of police misconduct. The Nichols case highlighted the urgent need for better training, more oversight, and a shift in how police interact with the communities they serve. As the trial of Tyre Nichols' killers concluded, the conversation around police reform and racial justice is far from over. Tyre Nichols' tragic death was a wake-up call, but it also provided an opportunity to make a meaningful change. The protests, the trial, and the ongoing efforts for police reform show that the fight for justice is far from finished. The memory of Tyre Nichols continues to drive this movement forward, with people across the country continuing to demand better for all victims of police violence. In the wake of this tragedy, it is clear that reform is necessary, not just for Tyre Nichols, but for every individual who has been wronged by the system. The hope is that his death will be not in vain, and that through continued advocacy, systemic change will come to law enforcement across the United States. What do you think about it? Let us know in the comments below. And if you found this story intriguing, please like, share, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this.